In this video, I'm going to tell you about some of the skills I use to get top job interviews and how to succeed in those interviews and get job offers. If you're new to the channel, you may not know I've worked at Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley and HSBC for over a decade. You can see my job offers here, which I also put on my website, link in description. And what I want to tell you throughout this video is explain to you some of the key skills in terms of going through the interview process, particularly because now many people are dealing with layoffs. And you're considering, okay, how can I actually plan for interviews, multiple interviews, technical interviews, make sure I conduct myself in a professional way and in terms of learning soft skills and things like that. So I'm going to cover all of that in this video, and you'll learn a lot more about those interview skills that got me those job offers that you can see quite clearly here. Again, it's on my website if you want to have a look. So if you are interested in these type of topics, right, feel free to subscribe. But if you're in this situation right now yourself, right, I can help you get started within a 12-week period. I'll teach you how to outsmart office politics, increase your salary, and take control of your career, right? So I've perfected the interview strategy perfectly, as you can see here, with those top companies, going through, 5 interviews, 9 interviews in some cases, and it's really worked well for me, right? So I've got a proven track record here. I'll show you some other evidence at the end of the video too. So if you want to work with me, link in description so we can get started right now. Let's go through this video. So first thing I want to talk about is how much time you should put into interview preparation, because many people think, okay, damn, I've got tons of interviews to prepare for and I'm making additional job applications. I mean, there's only so much time in the day. First thing I want to give you just a brief piece of general advice, something to do during your layoff period. Maybe if you're between jobs, you're searching for your next job, or even if you're in a current job that you're unhappy with, is try to find some sorts of time balance. And I know it's easier said than done, particularly if you're working a job, looking for another job, or if you're feeling kind of depressed because you can't find your next job because you just dealt with a layoff and things like that. I would say try to find a good healthy balance between, taking care of your health, whether that's going to the gym, taking care of your mental health too by going for long walks or whatever works for you, meditating, spending time with family. But if you schedule your day quite tightly and strategically, it will keep you going. It'll give you the energy to keep going and the momentum to keep going, which is quite important when you are going through many interviews and you are dealing with rejections, and that does have some impact on you, even if you try to be detached from it. And it just keeps the bigger goal in perspective, which could be, I'm getting my next job so I can work towards financial freedom or to spend more time with my family or whatever that would be. Now, let's go through this in a bit of detail. So how much time should you spend in terms of interview preparation? Now, you might have multiple interviews lined up from multiple different companies, or you have to work on job applications. So what I would say is the time you spend for interview preparation, you should think about it. If it's a top company, you dedicate more time to the preparation. If you're more likely to get the job and you're desperately seeking a job, you should dedicate more time to it. If it's like a long shot type of thing where it's a company that's a bit outside your industry expertise and your niche, then maybe you should put less time into it. I've done that, for example, where I've worked at some of the big banks I mentioned. And then when it was a company I wanted to work for and I had likelihood of getting there, like some of the crypto companies, I definitely put in more time there and were happy to do more interviews and did more preparation to prepare for those interviews. Now, there are other companies I work for which would be called like digital banks, like online banks, things like Monzo, Revolut, a few kind of companies in that niche, TransferWise, things like that. I ended up putting in less time for some of those interviews because it just seemed like a long shot. It was a bit out of the range of the type of jobs I'd been working, even though I got many interviews there and went through those interviews. I just dedicated less time to interview preparation. So again, if it's a top company, a Goldman Sachs, a Google, Amazon, Morgan Stanley, whatever that would be, put in more time to it. And if you're more likely to get the job and you really need the job, then of course put more time into it. But if it's a bit of a long shot, I would just dedicate maybe an hour of interview prep. Now, in terms of company research, now loads of people don't do company research and it shows. And I know this because I've interviewed people at some of these companies when I was at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley. And when I'm interviewing people while I'm working there, of course, people clearly just don't seem to have done any research. All they know is maybe the recent top headline. Like, for example, if I was working at Morgan Stanley and I'm interviewing candidates, they might know, okay, well, Morgan Stanley recently bought a wealth management company and they acquired it and they're looking at integrating it into their own wealth management business. And then you ask for more information about what they know about the role, how the role sits within the team, in the department, and in the broader business. They just don't know. They just don't have any idea. So it's like, firstly, you should know how that works or how your specific role is relevant to the broader company goals, right? And you can do this quite easily by going on their website, doing Google searches for recent news, checking specifically on their website what are their company values, which they also list. Typically, every company has some kind of corporate values page, so you know how you can maybe mention that a couple times and align it with some of your previous experience in the interviews. And there's always some interesting news that they have, whether it's publicly or on their website, like new projects, right? Any company you're working for, even if it's like a construction company, they'll probably announce, oh, we got a new project, maybe in a part of New York or London, they're working on that. And you might ask a few interesting questions on that. And that shows you're really interested in the role. You're not just, and you're interested in working at the company. You're not just kind of just someone who's trying to get through the interview and get the job. Now, I put together this helpful diagram to talk you through certain key things, whether it's skill development, doing some preparation about preparing for interview questions in terms of your work experience, considering whether you have enough time to do a crash course to learn a new skill, and then preparing for the typical questions and then getting the basics correct. So we're going to go through this right now. So you should firstly emphasize your relevant skills, right? What is relevant to the job description? Because many people, they just go into an interview, and like I say, it's so obvious how underprepared people are. I've prepared people and my clients for some top interviews at companies like Amazon, and sometimes it's kind of important for them to really put in the time and effort to improve their interview skills. And I do a lot of interview practice with them before those big interviews, so they do quite well in that interview process. Now, the whole thing is, firstly, you should look closely at the job description and see how much it aligns with your current skills and where are the gaps. Because sometimes you might be maybe working in a particular field, maybe it's a software engineer, and you're interviewing for a role to work as an architect in the tech department. And how can you align your current experience with that specific niche? Because it is a bit of a shift. It's not like you've worked in architect roles in the past, you've worked in software engineering. So then you have to kind of really consider how can you pivot your skills and present them in a way where you've done things that are quite similar to working as an architect, or you work closely with the architect team, you know how that works. That's quite important to do. And then those skills could also be certifications. So maybe you have less experience, but you can lean on the certifications. You did some AWS certifications. You did things relevant to becoming an architect, for example, in the tech field. But you might not have had as much experience, but you have experience as a software engineer. And if you combine those two things, the certification, AWS architect, with the software engineer expertise, you combine those and you can present it in a way like you are a good fit for the role. Now, the other thing is around relevant experience, right? You need to always frame your job experience so it aligns with the job description, right? So I'm not saying you should make up tons of things, but you can be a bit creative. So for example, if you're going from someone who works on a project to a project manager role, you might not have been explicitly a project manager, but you could say you were an assistant to your team leader who was a project manager. So you were the second in command. You were like an assistant to the project manager. The way that works is that you should know what your manager's doing, essentially. You should know how to do it well enough that you could do it in a new role. You don't have to be an expert at it, and you can always present yourself if you understand what your manager is doing, how he does it, and you have the core details and you've done something similar. You can always emphasize that and present yourself as, oh, I've managed projects before, even though I didn't have the official title of project manager. I worked alongside my official project manager to help manage these projects while I was doing my day-to-day role. So that's what you can kind of do, be a bit creative with it, right? And the other thing is around planning at least 1 week advance. If it's a big interview, I would definitely plan 1 week in advance, put together a bit of research on the company website, company news on any news site. Then I'd put together my experience, how it aligns with the job description, and then consider what are the most likely top questions, core competencies, technical questions that could come up. And if you prepare 1 week in advance, what ends up happening, firstly, it gets into your longer term memory because you've prepared 1 week in advance and then you prepared just before the interview itself. But also you end up thinking throughout the week, like, because you're going to be thinking, okay, I've got an interview coming up. I've put together some prep that I'll go through in more detail just the day before the interview. But is there anything else that could come up? So you start really thinking a bit creatively. Well, it says that on the job description. I know the company's growing in a particular direction. They might ask questions about what I did in another role. So you just kind of think about it leading up to that last minute interview prep. The other thing is preparing your work experience, right? Because of course, they're going to ask questions about your previous work experience and how it aligns with the company, right? So many people, they just don't really have good examples. Like, you should have good examples to mention if they say, for example, when did you manage a project? What is your awareness of maybe a new accounting rule, whatever it would be. So you should have some level of ability to mention that experience quite flawlessly, have those examples in your mind, and you can pivot that angle if needed. And what I mean by that is sometimes if you've worked, like I say, as one particular role, maybe a software engineer, but you're applying for an architect role, you can kind of pivot like, oh, I understand how an architect would look at this project, and I understand how a software engineer would, and how that differs, and how I can work in the architect role, even though I've been a software engineer. So you're pivoting that angle. You're not necessarily lying about it, but you're showing you fully understand the perspective from different roles, because you're pivoting the angle, pivoting the way you're describing it. Like, almost like I was in the software engineering role, but I was working closely with the architect team. I worked with them throughout the project life cycle and how to get information from our internal or external clients about what's needed and how to change our software development in alignment with those needs. You're understanding the client needs. So you're kind of showing you understand things from different perspectives, particularly when you're shifting from one particular type of role to another. The other thing is, lots of people talk about STAR, right? STAR, about organizing your answers like that in job interviews. Like, it's like situation, task, action, result, something like that. But I tend to simplify it, particularly because people have like low attention spans these days in interviews. People are just kind of rushing through it, even the person interviewing you. I would just simplify it, like, what was the situation, what was the fix I could find, and what was the result, right? So it's easier said than done. But once you do some of this prep, you can reuse it time and time and time again for every interview, rather than just only have it for one interview. So I wouldn't. Sometimes it's like you put a lot of time into prep for an interview and you get disappointed because you don't get the job. But the way I'd see it is, once you prepare for one interview in quite a lot of detail, particularly anything you do outside researching the company and company specific questions, you can reuse all of that interview prep time and time again for all your interviews and refine those answers. I remember going from HSBC to Goldman Sachs, and in between that time I was interviewing for many different hedge funds and private equity firms, so many so that I just knew I knew the questions almost before they were being said. I knew all the questions about my experience, how to rehash it, how to make it sound like I was doing more work than I was doing, or be exaggerating, be creative in a way that wasn't too over the top, but it was like, oh, I'm saying this, I've done a bit of it, I haven't done all of it, but I understand it well enough to answer in a job interview, and if I got the job, I could do it with just using a bit of initiative and being proactive and thinking on my feet at the time. So the whole thing is, you have to be able to kind of reiterate the process. So maybe you're 5 interviews down the line, rather than getting demotivated that you've done 5 job interviews, got 5 rejections for those interviews. You've improved each time your interview answer to some of the same questions. So it becomes better and better, and more likely you're going to get a job, rather than you getting demotivated and demoralized about it. The other thing is, consider the goal of the question, right? Lots of people don't want to consider the goal of the question. And what I mean by that is, sometimes they ask you like a leading question. For example, how have you previously incorporated the company's values when you're on a sales call? Maybe if you're applying for a sales role. So in that case, they're kind of like, okay, what was your previous company's corporate values or their structure of sales calls? And maybe doing the right thing by clients, providing additional advice to them where needed. And how does that align with our current company values, the company you're applying for? And how can you weave that into an answer? So it could be like, oh, I've worked at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, where they have core corporate values. One of them would be putting the client first. And in certain instances, I would do that by amending client trades where needed. I would work on them to understand their broader investment portfolio and how to meet their financial objectives, and also understand their risk profile. Because, for example, you could have instances where you're dealing with a pension fund and they want to have more conservative investments, maybe majority in government bonds, which are safer than the stock market. So I would analyze their particular risk profile, and in that case, I'd give them relevant investment advice on that basis. So you see how easy it can be to understand why they're asking that question, and then you answer accordingly. It reminds me of just some social interactions you might deal with people when they're asking you. We've all dealt with people like this where they ask you very intrusive questions that are just inappropriate about your personal life or about your finances, and you can kind of sense why they're asking that question. They're asking it because they're trying to gain a certain type of answer. So it's the same thing applies here when it comes to job interviews. Now, I wouldn't say you should always do a crash course on a particular industry niche if you're applying for a job. But if you are in that example I keep mentioning about a software engineer shifting to an architect role, if you do have enough time and the interview is like 2 weeks away or even 1 week away, you might be able to do a crash course online, typically, on Udemy, on Skillshare, on different course websites like that. You can just simply log in and do quite a easy course. Maybe it takes you 1 day to do it. Maybe it's an 8-hour course, and you maybe speed run it, go through the couple key sections. If you are particularly in situations where you're applying for roles that are slightly outside of your niche, or you just need a crash course in it, and I'd definitely recommend you consider that, because if you've got a big opportunity like an interview on Amazon or something like that, it makes sense to kind of put that time together and learn a bit more, not only about the company through researching their company site, but learning a bit more about a new area of your industry that you're not aware of, because it'll help you for that job interview. It'll help you for future job interviews. And you're continually improving your skill set in the process. And I'm sure it won't be a complete waste of time. I've done online courses before. Some of them a bit kind of light on content, but it was enough to give solid answers about some of those particular topics. Now you've got to consider, are you ready for the typical questions? And like I said, I've interviewed many candidates when I was working at some of these top banks, and obviously interviewing myself to get some of those opportunities. So typically it's so interesting how which questions reoccur time and time again. Why it's obvious which candidates haven't done any research or preparation. Many people are just like nervous. They're kind of excitable about the job interview. They want to work for maybe a big name company, but they haven't done a lot of prep. They don't have the level of being grounded, showing enthusiasm, being grounded, and knowing answers to some of the basic questions. And like I say, because I'd went through so many interviews, by the time I'm on like my 5th hedge fund interview at a 5th company, I'd went through some of these answers so many times. I knew the technical questions very easily because I knew some of those areas that would come up, right? Talking about short selling, if you're familiar with finances and trading, short selling is a big thing, right, with some of these hedge funds. So I knew about the technical questions there. And then when it comes to these other type of questions, tell us about yourself. Why do you want this job? Technical questions. Do you have any questions for us? These are the type of questions that come up again and again. So you should have an easy answer to that, right? Telling me about yourself is not like asking you about your personal life and things. Is asking about what went on in your career that led you to this point. Maybe you worked in finance, then you worked in tech, now you're applying for fintech. You're mentioning a few points about your experience in both those areas, why you want to work for a startup and help them grow and things like that. Then it becomes, why do you want this job, right? Then that comes down to company research, how you match your skills to the job description, and how you can show enthusiasm through like, I want to work here because I'm interested in this project or that project, right? Then technical questions, of course, for any role, certain technical questions could come up. I mentioned short selling. When it comes to hedge funds, that's a common thing they do, or understanding their investment strategy and being able to explain it quite simply. Then it's like, do you have any questions for us? Now, lots of interviews end like that. So you could ask questions about the team structure. You can ask the questions around growth potential of the team, whether it's the team growing or your ability to grow within the role and take additional responsibilities. You could ask about what projects they're working on and how that's linked to the broader company's goals, or if they're involved in any of the projects that are being mentioned in the media. Like I say, if Amazon's launching a new AI initiative and you're going into a tech role, you could say, we'll be helping that AI project that I've seen recently in business news, things like that. So it's showing initiative and showing interest, but more important than that is helping you gauge what the role is actually like. Like there's a big difference between working for a 5-person team than a 20-person team, right? Because in a 20-person team, I've seen this, for example, at JP Morgan and things like that, you might be working in trade surveillance. And those roles typically have big teams. And what that means is you're just sitting at your desk going through one alert after the other. And it's kind of mind-numbingly boring bullshit. And you're just like going through checking one trade, checking it against the market price, checking against what the trading strategy was, making sure they weren't manipulating the market. It's just like a really boring audit type of job. And typically you can gauge things like that based on the team size. Like if it's a small team and you're going to be working on maybe a team of 10 and you're working in a small team within that, maybe 2 or 3 people focused on a specific business area, like I've done before, working on credit trading at Goldman Sachs or FX, a few different areas there at Morgan Stanley too, and rates trading, things like that, commodities trading. So it's kind of like we all had small teams within a bigger team, and that means you can work closely together. You learn a lot of technical knowledge. You work on a lot of different technical live questions, rather than just being just another number in a big team that they can replace at any moment. So when you're asking questions, you're showing interest, but you're really gathering information. Is it a big team? Is it a small team? Have they had any internal changes? You can read in between the lines what's going on. And one thing that I always find interesting, and I never ask it directly, but you can gauge like, when I'm applying for this role, is this because the team's growing, or am I replacing someone else who was previously doing this role who's moved on? And then what they do is they end up giving you quite a lot of information, more information than you'd expect. So you might learn like, this person was working in the role, but they moved to another part of the company, or they left the company, or we're actually growing the team because we have more demand from the business. So that's quite interesting. So you learn, am I replacing someone who is, you'll be able to read in between the lines from the answer. Are you replacing someone who is unhappy with the role? Are you replacing someone who realized there's no growth potential in the role, so they had to move on after a little while? Is the team growing, which means the business is growing, which means that, it's a good sign of you having job stability, at least for 2 to 3 years, because they'll need someone in that role. So you could really gauge a lot more than you probably think you could. And that's the thing. And I know when people see these questions, particularly the last one, do you have any questions for us? They think, that's a complete waste of time. You can't always think like that. You have to think, how can I leverage this to learn something that's going to benefit me, and rather than just pretending to put on a show for a company. Next thing is getting the basics correct, dressing correct, being on time, being calm. Those things are quite obvious, but people get these wrong, right? They come across a bit arrogant. Sometimes they can be late for the interview. They can be too excited and not be calm. And the thing is, it's good to work for a big name company like a Goldman's, Morgan Stanley, Amazon, Google, whatever it would be. But it's good that you show enthusiasm, but you don't want to come across like someone who's like a fanboy or a stan, and someone who's a fanboy, fangirl type of behavior. If you come across too over the top, it might come across like you're desperate for the job, or you're going to basically be a pushover in the role, where people will be able to dump extra work on you because you're so desperate for the role and desperate for their approval and validation. I tend to just come across calm and interested, and you can show the interest and enthusiasm through some of the research you did, rather than being so excited and like over the top, which is just a bit awkward. I've seen that quite a few times. Next thing is next steps. So let's just say you've had the job interview and what you're going to do next. Now, there's 2 ways you can handle this, right? So firstly, you can send a thank you email maybe one day after the interview saying, it was great to speak with X and Y, whatever the names of the interviewers were, and you're emailing HR, the hiring manager, or them directly, whatever that would be. It was great to speak with them. I'm eager for the job, and it was interesting discussing certain topics, like let's just say the new acquisition that Amazon had of another company and how that's growing the business. And then also just say, I'll be interested in discussing this further and moving forward with the process if possible, as I'd like to help with XYZ in terms of my skills. That's one approach you can take. Maybe one day after the interview, send a thank you email showing your enthusiasm, because most people won't do that. The other thing is an update request email after. What that could be is after 1 week or maybe 2 weeks, I would say 1 week maximum. You would send them an email, something similar to the thank you email, and just saying, I'm just eager to find out if there's been any update regarding the interview process for this role. And once you've done that, that will kind of be the next step in terms of being on their radar, and they'll let you know if they're interviewing others or it's going to take a bit more time, just so you can emphasize your enthusiasm for the role and get an update if possible. The next thing is the job offer, right? So let's just say you go through the interview process, you get the job offer, then you need to come into salary negotiations. Now, I know a lot of people want to do salary negotiations at the start of the interview process. And what you have to understand is most salaries, they have quite a broad range, particularly in corporate. So they might say they want someone with 10 years experience, but then they realize, well, if they hire you and maybe you have 5 years experience, they can offer you a lower salary because you have less experience, but also you get the opportunity, of course, to work the role that might be bit beyond your level of experience. You can quickly learn new skills, and then you can kind of move forward in your career and then renegotiate at a later stage for a higher salary. So the whole thing is firstly to know the salary range, if possible, if it's been posted or the recruiter or hiring managers let you know. Do a bit of research. You can find out on Glassdoor or other websites what the rough salary range would be within that particular location and industry niche. And of course, you'd aim for the higher end. So let's just say the salary range for a finance job would be 70,000 to 100,000. You would aim for that top end, of course, in the negotiation, and then they might talk you down and say, you're aiming for 100K. We can offer maybe, we were advertised at around 80K. We can offer you 90K if you're eager to start soon. There might be some kind of flexibility there. So always do a bit of research and move forward with that. Then, of course, they do some background checks on your resume and your employment and things like that. And then the last minute job prep that you should look to do before you start the role, like the week before the job, is learn basic software skills, do a bit of research about the company's recent developments, if that's relevant to your role. And then don't appear like someone who's kind of a complete newbie, a complete noob who's starting a job and, you know, he doesn't know what's going on. Really try to take the experience you have from a previous company there. So what I mean by that is if there's a level of professionalism that is expected in your industry, apply that, dress well, speak well, carry yourself with self-respect, because you don't want to be a pushover. I've seen that happen before. You don't want to burn out and get tons of work dumped on you. You want to set clear boundaries, arrive to work on time, maybe slightly earlier, 5 minutes earlier, leave late and leave on time or slightly later, maybe 5 to 20 minutes, whatever that would be. The whole point is you set the tone. The same way they set expectations with you from the start, whether there's a probation period or not. Like, oh, we need you to do this amount of work. This is what we'd expect from you. You have to set the tone with them. Like, so you don't end up being the employee who's always staying late, who's always having to come in early, who's always getting extra work, who's always doing things to help others and they're not doing anything to help you. That's why you've got to set the boundaries quite early. The other thing I'd say is try to learn any additional skills that could help you in the role. So say you are moving into a new role, slightly new skills, and it's starting 1 month from now, you can easily do a short course online that will help you for that. If it's a project management role, you could, for example, do a quick course online that would maybe 1 to 2 hours a day. You do that, and within a week, you've completed a whole level of experience you've developed through learning all these technical terms that will probably come up in the role that you probably haven't heard of or know too much about, but you've been able to quickly learn about that. The other thing I want to talk about is office rules, because when you start the job, you're going to pick up on some office rules, like what is the general office consensus? Because unfortunately, in a lot of corporate environments, it's all about consensus. Is everyone leaving early on a Friday? Like I worked for one data analytics company in the finance industry, and they had all these work drinks on Friday, but not after work, surprisingly, during work. It'd be like midday on a Friday. The company was paying for like beers in the office because they had a large canteen area, orange juice, all these other type of things. And what would end up happening is they'd just finish early every Friday afternoon, and people could leave about 3 p.m. on that day. So what is that kind of pattern? The other thing is, are people arriving early on certain days? When do you have a regular team meeting? How can you schedule your work so you can give those updates within those team meetings to impress others, and you don't burn yourself out by doing too much extra work too quickly? What is the pace other people are working at? Work at a similar pace. Don't work too fast if you're not going to get paid to do that, and they're just going to dump extra work on you. Learn all the office rules. Another thing could be, if you know your manager or team members maybe leave early on a Wednesday, for example, because they have a meeting off site, you might want to book a meeting room for yourself, and then you can take your laptop there, pretend to work, and watch anime on your tablet or your phone or whatever. The whole point is, once you learn the rules, you learn how to cut into the company time and use them like they're using you. Now, here's a quick sample of other companies I've successfully interviewed at, right? JP Morgan, I've interviewed there, several rounds of interviews for several jobs. I've also interviewed successfully at CISI for multiple roles, and Deutsche Bank, right? So throughout my career, when I was shifting between like HSBC to Goldman's to Morgan Stanley and other finance firms, I've been actively interviewing at many other top banks. So that's even more evidence of, what I'm saying actually does work, because I've reached advanced stages in those, in some cases getting job offers too. So the whole point I want you to understand is, you do a bit of interview preparation depending on the role and how much time you have available. Then you prepare for specific questions. Of course, they're going to ask you about your work experience, some generic questions about you, how you conduct yourself. And then lastly, you're going to have some next steps and job offer negotiations and job prep to do. So that's a good quick crash course for 30 minutes. If you apply this, you'd probably do well in a lot of interviews. And like I say, I work on this process in a lot more detail than it is here, step by step, one interview after the other, multiple rounds of interview practice with my clients, so they can get those top roles. Some of my clients have successfully interviewed for companies like Amazon, got job offers at Riot Games, top gaming development companies. I've worked with other clients in the finance niche, project management, engineering, helping them with office politics there. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot you can learn from this. So I look forward to working with you directly. Link in description to speak with me. Let me know in the comments how you feel about job interviews, and I'll see you in the next video.